Many times in life, we find ourselves battling challenges that seem insurmountable. Whether it's financial struggles, family issues, or internal conflicts, the weight of carrying these burdens on our own can feel overwhelming. We try to resolve everything in our strength, thinking that if we just push harder, we'll eventually break through. But what happens when the fight drags on and our strength begins to fade? Fighting alone leads to exhaustion. Our human capacity has limits, and when we reach those limits, despair often follows. We might question our faith, our purpose, and even the presence of God in our lives. The silence during these moments can be deafening, making us feel isolated and abandoned. But this loneliness is not a punishment. It's often a signal that we need to shift our perspective and trust in something greater than ourselves. God never intended for us to carry our burdens alone. The Bible reminds us, time and again, that we should cast our anxieties on Him because He cares for us. Yet, in our human nature, we often resist surrendering control, thinking that we need to solve our problems without divine help. This resistance is where many of our struggles intensify, as we fail to acknowledge our need for God's intervention. In this message, we will explore the power of surrendering everything to God. We'll see how, when we stop fighting alone and hand our battles over to the Lord, the outcome changes. This isn't a call to passivity, but an invitation to trust in the one who holds the ultimate power to transform our lives. One of the hardest truths to accept is that we, as human beings, are limited. Despite our best efforts, there are moments when our strength, knowledge, and resources fall short. We live in a world that glorifies self-reliance and individualism, often making us feel like failures when we can't handle everything on our own. Yet, recognizing our limitations is not a sign of weakness. It's an acknowledgement of our humanity. We were never meant to face life's challenges without support. The Bible teaches that our strength comes not from ourselves, but from God. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. This scripture is a profound reminder that our understanding is limited, and it's in that limitation where faith must step in. Acknowledging our limits allows us to embrace humility. It reminds us that we are not in control of everything, and that's okay. In fact, it's often through our weaknesses that God's power is made evident. The Apostle Paul, in 2 Corinthians 12 verse 9, shares that God's grace is sufficient for us and that His power is made perfect in weakness. Our struggles, then, are not something to hide or be ashamed of, but opportunities to rely more deeply on God's strength. By recognizing our human limitations, we open the door to God's boundless capacity. It is in this space of surrender that we can move beyond the frustration of our failures and into the peace that comes from trusting in God's plan. When we stop trying to control every outcome and instead invite God to take the lead, we find that the burden is lifted and the path becomes clearer. Surrendering to God is often misunderstood. Many people equate surrender with giving up, weakness, or defeat. But biblical surrender is not about quitting. It's about releasing control into the hands of a loving and powerful Creator. It's an intentional act of faith, acknowledging that God's ways are higher than our ways, and His plans are far better than anything we could devise. True surrender begins with trust. When we surrender to God, we are saying, "Lord, I trust You with every part of my life. I trust Your timing, Your wisdom, and Your will for me." This trust isn't blind, but based on the assurance that God is sovereign and His love for us is perfect. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us of this promise. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Surrendering to God is an expression of confidence in His perfect plan for our lives. Surrender brings freedom. When we let go of the need to control every detail, we find peace. The burden of trying to manage life's complexities is too heavy for any of us to bear alone. Jesus Himself invites us in Matthew 11 and verse 28-30, saying, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." When we surrender, we exchange the weight of our struggles for the rest and comfort that only God can provide. It's a profound release, one that allows us to live fully, without the constant anxiety of what tomorrow may bring. Lastly, surrender to God unlocks His power in our lives. When we step back, we allow God to step in. His strength becomes our strength, His wisdom our guide. The miracles and breakthroughs we seek often come when we stop striving in our own power and place everything in God's hands. In this place of surrender, God's grace and mercy flow freely, bringing transformation where we thought there was none, and peace in the midst of chaos. This is the true power of surrendering to God, allowing Him to take control and work wonders beyond what we can imagine. One of the most profound examples of surrender in the Bible is found in the life of Jesus, specifically during His time in the Garden of Gethsemane. As the hour of His crucifixion approached, Jesus withdrew to the garden to pray, knowing the immense suffering that awaited Him. In this moment of deep anguish, Jesus displayed both His humanity and His complete trust in God's will. The Bible tells us that Jesus was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Matthew 26:38. He knew the physical and spiritual torment that He would soon endure. In His prayer He asked, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as You will." Matthew 26:39. This plea reveals the depth of His humanity, His desire to avoid the pain and suffering. But even in His distress, Jesus chose to surrender fully to the Father's will. What stands out in this moment is that Jesus did not fight against His fate, nor did He run from it. Instead, He laid His fears and desires before God, submitting Himself completely to the Father's plan. This act of surrender wasn't easy, and it wasn't without struggle. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus was in such agony that His sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Luke 22 verse 44. Yet, despite the anguish, He chose obedience over personal comfort. Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane teaches us that surrendering to God doesn't mean we won't experience fear, doubt, or pain. It shows that true surrender involves trusting God's will, even when it's difficult, even when we don't understand why certain things must happen. Jesus knew the cross was ahead, but He also knew that God's plan was for a greater purpose, one that would bring salvation to humanity. The Garden of Gethsemane stands as a powerful reminder that surrender requires courage. It's not about avoiding the struggles or pretending that everything is easy. Rather, it's about trusting that God is with us in those struggles, just as He was with Jesus. And like Jesus, when we surrender our will to God's, we can face even the greatest trials with the assurance that His purpose will prevail. When we choose to surrender everything to God, something transformative begins to happen, not only in our circumstances, but more importantly, within us. The act of letting go and placing our lives in God's hands brings about a profound shift in our hearts and minds. It is in this space of surrender that we experience God's peace, guidance, and the power of His presence in ways we never could while trying to control everything ourselves. First, surrendering to God brings peace. The constant struggle to fix everything on our own can lead to stress, anxiety, and exhaustion. However, when we hand our problems and worries over to God, we experience the peace that surpasses all understanding, Philippians 4:7. This peace doesn't come because all of our problems disappear, but because we trust that God is in control and He is working all things together for our good, Romans 8:28. It's a peace that calms our hearts, knowing that we are no longer alone in our battles. Second, we begin to see God's hand more clearly when we surrender. Often we are so focused on our own plans and desires that we miss what God is doing around us. But when we give everything to Him, we open our hearts to His guidance and allow Him to direct our paths. Proverbs 16:9 says, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." In surrender, we stop resisting and start walking in alignment with God's will, which leads us to places of blessing and purpose we might never have imagined. Surrender also unlocks the power of God in our lives. The Bible is full of stories where God's miraculous intervention came after someone gave up trying to solve things on their own and instead trusted in Him. Think of Moses at the Red Sea, or Joshua at the walls of Jericho. In each case, it was not human strength or strategy that brought victory. It was God's power at work through surrendered lives. When we surrender, we invite God to move in ways that go beyond our human limitations. Finally, surrendering everything to God changes us. It refines our character, deepens our faith, and strengthens our relationship with Him. The more we let go and trust God, the more we grow in our understanding of His love and faithfulness. Our lives become less about striving and more about resting in His grace, which transforms us from the inside out. We become people who walk in the freedom that comes from knowing we belong to a God who holds the universe in His hands and who cares deeply for us personally. This is the power of surrender. It allows God to work in ways we cannot, and it fills us with a peace, strength, and joy that only He can provide. When we give everything to God, we are not losing control. We are gaining a life that is aligned with His perfect will. Throughout the ages, countless individuals have experienced profound transformation and renewal through the act of surrendering their lives to God. These testimonies serve as powerful reminders of God's faithfulness and the incredible changes that can occur when we let go of our struggles and trust in His plans. Each story is unique, yet they all share a common thread: the life-changing power of surrender. One such testimony comes from a man named John, who battled addiction for many years. Despite numerous attempts to overcome his struggles through sheer willpower, he found himself repeatedly falling back into the same patterns of behavior. It wasn't until John hit rock bottom, feeling utterly defeated and hopeless, that he cried out to God for help. In that moment of surrender, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. He began attending a faith-based recovery program where he learned to rely on God's strength instead of his own. Over time, John not only found freedom from his addiction, but also discovered a new purpose in helping others find hope and healing in their struggles. Another powerful story comes from Maria, a woman who struggled with anxiety and fear for most of her life. No matter how much she tried to manage her worries, they would consume her thoughts and prevent her from living fully. One night, overwhelmed by panic, Maria decided to surrender her fears to God in prayer. She recounted her worries one by one and asked God to take them from her. As she prayed, she felt a shift within her, a sense of lightness and relief. From that day forward, Maria made it a habit to bring her anxieties to God daily, often using scripture to remind herself of His promises. Gradually, her anxiety diminished, replaced by a renewed sense of peace and confidence in God's presence in her life. Then there's the story of David, who was once consumed by bitterness and anger following a painful betrayal. He felt justified in holding on to these feelings, believing they protected him from further hurt. However, as he learned more about God's grace and forgiveness, David realized that his bitterness was only hurting him. In a moment of surrender, he decided to forgive those who had wronged him, even though it was incredibly difficult. Through this act of surrender, David found liberation from the chains of anger and resentment that had bound him for so long. God transformed his heart, replacing bitterness with compassion and healing, and David now shares his story to inspire others to experience the freedom that comes from forgiveness. These testimonies remind us that surrender is not just a one-time event, but a continuous journey of transformation. When we choose to give our battles to God, we open ourselves to the incredible work He can do in our lives. Each story reflects the biblical truth that God can take our brokenness and make it beautiful, turning our pain into purpose. As we trust Him with our struggles, He renews our hearts. In surrendering our battles to God, we unlock the transformative power of His love and grace in our lives. As we relinquish control and trust in His perfect plan, we experience peace, renewal, and the strength to overcome even the most challenging struggles. Remember, you are never alone in this journey. God is always by your side, ready to guide and support you. Thank you for watching. If you found this message helpful, please like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for our next video. Your support means a lot.